The night they toasted my brother for being self-made, I was sitting 3 seats away, watching the life drain out of my bank account. My mother lifted her glass, her eyes wet with a pride I had never earned, and called Julian a visionary who had built a kingdom from nothing. I didn't blink. I didn't scream. I just stared at the blue light of my phone as the $12,000 warehouse payment I'd covered that morning flipped from pending to complete. In that moment, I realized I wasn't his sister. I was just the silent, invisible floor he stepped on to reach the stars. My name is Vera Collins, and that was the last time I let my family confuse my sacrifice for their success. The Drake Hotel's grand ballroom was a cathedral of gilded mirrors and suffocating tradition. It was the kind of place where the Chicago elite gathered to congratulate themselves on the fortunes they had inherited or extracted. I sat at table 12, my spine a rigid line against the velvet upholstery, feeling the weight of the silk dress I'd bought on sale. It was the only thing in this room that wasn't a lie. At the head of the room, my mother, Eleanor, stood at the mahogany podium. She looked radiant in champagne lace, her pearls reflecting the soft, buttery glow of the chandeliers. She cleared her throat, and the room fell into a respectful, expensive silence. Julian Collins represents the new American dream, Eleanor began. Her voice vibrated with a pride that felt like a physical pressure against my chest. A man who looked at the logistics crisis and said, "I can do it better." He didn't ask for a path, he cut one. Without a single handout, without a penny of family money, he built Summit Logistics from a vision into a powerhouse. He is truly, in every sense of the word, a self-made man. The applause was a sudden, violent wave. Men in tailored tuxedos and women dripping in diamonds stood to honor my brother. I remained seated. My hands were clasped tightly in my lap to hide the tremor in my fingers. Beneath the white linen tablecloth, the screen of my phone was a cold, blue rectangular eye staring back at me. Notification: wire transfer of $12,000 to Illinois Department of Revenue, complete. I had authorized it 45 minutes ago, right as the appetizers were being served. It was the third emergency tax bridge I had covered for Julian in 6 months. Without that money, the state would have impounded his fleet by dawn. The self-made visionary would have been just a man with a shuttered warehouse and a mountain of lawsuits. Julian rose from his seat, the golden award in his hand catching the light. He was the picture of effortless success, tan, fit, and wearing a smirk he'd practiced until it looked like humility. As he stepped to the podium, he caught my eye. He didn't look humbled. He looked triumphant. He was a predator who knew his prey was too loyal to ever strike back. "I owe this to my family," Julian said into the microphone. His voice was smooth as aged scotch. "For their unwavering belief. For staying out of the way and letting me prove what a man can do when he stands on his own 2 feet. He raised his glass toward me. A silent, mocking toast. He knew I was the invisible architect of this moment. He knew that every time he stumbled, I was the one who broke my own fall to catch him. My mother leaned over, her eyes shimmering with tears. She squeezed my wrist, her grip tight. "Isn't he magnificent, Vera?" she whispered. "He's exactly like your father was, a force of nature. I only wish you had a bit more of his initiative." The irony was a bitter pill I couldn't swallow. I am a forensic accountant. I spend my days unearthing the rot hidden behind beautiful balance sheets. I understand the math of survival better than anyone in this room. Yet, in this family, I was merely the practical daughter. The one with the stable job. The one who held the ladder while Julian reached for the stars. As the gala continued, the noise of the ballroom faded into a dull roar. All I could feel was the throb in my back molar. It was a dull, insistent ache. I'd canceled my own dental surgery last month to ensure Julian's payroll cleared. My silence wasn't love. It was a subsidy for a myth that was slowly erasing my own existence. I looked at the reflection of the gilded mirrors. I didn't see a successful family. I saw a ghost holding up a pedestal. For the first time in 34 years, I wondered what would happen if I simply stepped away. I looked at Julian, basking in the standing ovation and realized the pedestal was made of glass. And glass is so very easy to break. 2 nights later, the silence of my apartment in the West Loop felt like a physical weight. The city of Chicago hummed outside my window, the distant, metallic screech of the L train and the persistent wind rattling the glass. But inside, there was only the hum of my laptop and the rhythm of my shallow breathing. I couldn't sleep. The toothache I'd been ignoring had evolved from a dull thrum into a sharp, electric protest every time I closed my jaw. I sat at my desk, the only light coming from the twin monitors that served as my true confessionals. I spent the next 6 hours doing what I do for corporate clients who suspect internal embezzlement. I was following the blood trail of the money. I pulled my comprehensive credit report, a document I usually kept in pristine condition. My stomach did a slow, sickening flip. My debt-to-income ratio had spiked into the red. I scrolled through the lines of credit, my eyes narrowing as I scanned the fine print. There, buried under the standard utilities and my modest student loan, was a ghost. Vanguard Leasing, recurring payment $3,000. I felt the blood drain from my face. I don't lease equipment, I take the train. I don't own a car, let alone a corporate fleet SUV, as the subline indicated. I pulled the digital copies of the original lease agreement. My hands were cold as I clicked the PDF. The document was professional, dated 18 months ago, exactly when Julian claimed Summit Logistics had hit its stride. My name was typed in bold at the top as the primary lessee. I scrolled to the final page, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. There was the signature, Vera Collins. It was a beautiful imitation. It had the right weight, the right slant, the right loop on the L, but Julian had always been arrogant, and arrogance breeds sloppiness. He had spent his childhood watching me do our homework, watching me sign the permission slips he'd lost. He knew my hand, but he didn't know my soul. I always slanted my capital V to the left. He had slanted this one to the right, a confident, aggressive stroke that screamed his name instead of mine. He hadn't just been taking my savings. He had been stealing my identity to fund the optics of his success. The $60,000 SUV he drove to the country club, the one he claimed was a performance bonus from his board, was anchored to my social security number. If he missed a payment, it wasn't his vision that would suffer, it was my future. I opened a new spreadsheet. I titled it, The Julian Audit. I began to color-code the entries, gray for the money I had given him willingly out of a misplaced sense of sisterly duty, red for the money he had taken through deception. I cross-referenced my bank statements with his emergency requests. I found transfers I didn't even remember authorizing, small amounts, 200 here, 500 there, always timed when I was at my busiest at the firm. As the sun began to bleed over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges, the spreadsheet told a story that no gala speech could ever cover. The self-made man was a parasite. He had been cannibalizing my credit, my savings, and my reputation to build a house of cards that looked like a castle. The realization brought a strange, cold clarity. In my professional life, when I find a crimson ledger like this, there is no room for sentiment. There is only the audit and the consequences. I looked at the forged signature on the screen, that V leaning the wrong way, and I felt a tectonic shift in my own identity. I was no longer the fixer. I was the auditor, and the audit was finally closed. I realized then that Julian didn't just need my money. He needed my shadow. He needed the world to believe that Vera Collins, the woman who spent her life catching liars, vouched for him. I was the lamb's clothing for the wolf. I stared at the screen until the numbers blurred into a single, undeniable truth. My brother hadn't just used me, he had tried to erase me, and now I was going to make sure he was the one who disappeared. The following morning, Chicago was a study in monochromatic gray. The fog rolled off Lake Michigan in thick, heavy sheets, swallowing the tops of the skyscrapers and turning the streets of Lincoln Park into a hazy, muted labyrinth. I met my cousin Beatrice at a small, tucked-away cafe where the smell of roasted beans usually offered me a sense of order. Today, the aroma felt like ash in my throat. Beatrice was already there, glowing in a way I hadn't seen since before her husband, David, had passed away 18 months ago. She was a single mother now, navigating the terrifying waters of grief and a 5-year-old's future. When she saw me, she practically beamed, waving me over with a hand that seemed lighter and freer than it had in years. "Vera, you have to talk to your brother," she whispered the moment I sat down. She leaned over her latte with a conspiratorial excitement that made my skin crawl. "I know you're the silent partner in all of this, but Julian is being an absolute saint. He's opened up a platinum-tier investment pool at Summit Logistics. He told me that because David was like a brother to him, he'd personally manage the life insurance payout. He's guaranteeing a 12% return." My stomach dropped with the force of a failed elevator. I felt the color drain from my face as I processed the numbers. David's life insurance was Beatrice's only safety net. That was the money meant for mortgage payments and a college fund that hadn't even been started yet. "Beatrice," I started, my voice sounding like it was coming from a great distance. 12% is an aggressive guarantee in this market. It's almost impossible. "Did he show you the prospectus? Did he provide a liquidity report or a certified audit?" Beatrice let out a light, tinkling laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Oh, Vera, don't be such a forensic accountant. This isn't a corporate takeover, it's family." He showed me the internal ledgers. He showed me the transfers from your private consulting firm. He said you were the lead investor and that your firm's backing was the reason he could offer such a high yield to the inner circle. He said, "If you're the one holding the floor, I know I don't have to worry." I looked out the window at the blurred shapes of pedestrians passing by in the mist. The betrayal was no longer just financial, it was biological. Julian wasn't just stealing from me. He was using my name, my professional integrity, and my hard-won reputation as a lure to trap a widow in a Ponzi scheme. He was using the money I had loaned him to pay out dividends to other family members, creating an illusion of profit that was nothing more than my own blood being moved from one vein to another. I realized then that Julian didn't just need my money, he needed my shadow. He needed the world to believe that Vera Collins, the woman who spent her life catching liars, vouched for him. I was the lamb's clothing for the wolf. As Beatrice prattled on about the new school she could now afford for her son, I felt a cold, iron resolve settle in my marrow. I couldn't just walk away anymore. If I didn't stop him, I was an accomplice to the destruction of my own blood. I was the anchor he was using to drown everyone else. The more she spoke, the more I saw the architecture of his lie. It wasn't just a business that was failing, it was a systemic harvest of everyone who trusted the Collins name. Julian had sat at that gala, accepting an award for independence, while he was actively cannibalizing the futures of people who couldn't afford to lose a dime. I reached across the table and took Beatrice's hand. Her skin was warm, unsuspecting. I wanted to tell her right then. I wanted to scream that the money was gone. But as a forensic auditor, I knew that a premature strike would only let the rat scurry back into the drywall. I needed the paper trail to be absolute. I needed to let him think he was still winning for just a few more hours. I forced a smile that felt like a scar. "I'm glad you're feeling secure, B," I said. "I'll definitely be talking to Julian." She squeezed my hand, thanking me for being the smart one, the one who kept the family stable. I walked out into the Chicago fog, the weight of the audit folder under my arm feeling like a loaded weapon. The shadow I had provided for Julian was about to become the darkness that swallowed his entire world. He wanted a lead investor. Well, he was about to find out exactly what happens when the lead pulls the floor out from under the deal. I didn't care about the family name anymore. I cared about the truth, and the truth was going to be the only thing left standing when the mist finally cleared. Sunday brunch at the Collins estate was a ritual of practiced elegance. The dining room was a sea of white linen, polished silver, and the rhythmic clinking of baccarat crystal. My father, Arthur, sat at the head of the table, his presence commanding and stern, while a leaner fluttered about, ensuring the truffle omelets were served at the precise temperature of wealth. Julian was in rare form, dressed in a cashmere sweater that suggested a man who had never spent a single hour inside a hot warehouse. To the future, he announced, raising a crystal flute filled with pale gold mimosa, "We're finalizing the Jersey warehouse hub this week." It's the move that takes Summit Logistics from a local player to a national titan. My mother clapped her hands, her eyes shining with that familiar, blinded adoration. "It's marvelous, Julian. Your father always said the East Coast was the key." Julian smiled, that practiced hollow smirk, and then his eyes locked onto mine. He reached into his leather portfolio and slid a heavy, cream-colored envelope across the table toward me. It landed with a soft thud next to my plate, displacing a sprig of garnish. "Vera, I just need your signature on the bridge mortgage for the New Jersey site," he said. He kept his voice light, conversational, as if he weren't asking me to anchor my entire financial life to his latest sinking ship. "It's a standard formality. The bank just needs to see your investment partner status confirmed on the deed to finalize the interest rate. We need it by end of business tomorrow." The table went silent. My father looked at me expectantly, his bushy eyebrows raised. My mother smiled encouragingly, already mentally decorating a New Jersey office she'd never visit. They were waiting for the practical daughter to perform her function. They wanted me to sign the document that would legally tether my future to Julian's newest, most dangerous lie. I didn't reach for the pen. Instead, I pulled my phone from my handbag and placed it squarely in the center of the table, right on top of the lace runner. "I spent the morning taking care of some formalities of my own, Julian," I said. My voice was steady. It was stripped of the guilt that had been my leash for a decade. I tapped the screen, turning it so the entire table could see the scrolling list of confirmation emails. As of 8 o'clock this morning, I have revoked my status as a guarantor on all Summit Logistics accounts. I have deactivated the corporate fleet insurance and the fuel cards linked to my personal credit. And I have officially notified the software provider for your dispatch system that I am no longer an authorized payer. The servers will go dark at midnight unless you provide a new, independent line of credit. The silence that followed was so absolute, I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Julian's tan seemed to evaporate, leaving his face a sickly, pale gray. My father's fork hit his plate with a sharp metallic ring. "Vera, what on earth is this?" His voice was a low, dangerous rumble. "You're embarrassing your brother, at the dinner table over a petty grievance." "It's not a grievance, Dad," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "It's an audit. I'm not signing the New Jersey mortgage. In fact, I'm not signing anything ever again. If Julian is truly self-made, then today is the day he gets to prove it. I'm done being the invisible floor beneath his feet." I stood up, leaving the cream-colored envelope unopened. Julian's hand trembled as he reached for his glass, the gold keychain on his belt loop catching the morning sun like a taunt. He looked like a man who had just realized the bridge he was standing on was made of nothing but my silence, and I had just stopped whispering. I watched him try to find his voice, tried to find a way to charm his way out of a reality that didn't accept smiles as currency. My mother's hand went to her throat, her pearls clutched in a grip of pure panic. But I didn't stay for the excuses. I walked out of that dining room, the heavy scent of truffles and pretension fading behind me. I had spent years worrying about the family name, but as I stepped out into the crisp morning air, I realized a name is just a word. Integrity, however, is a number, and Julian S. was finally at 0. My brother had wanted a partner. Instead, he'd found the one person who knew exactly how to dismantle the myth he had spent 18 months building. This wasn't just a business failing, it was the end of a dynasty of lies. And as I started my car, I knew that tomorrow, the world would finally see exactly what Julian Collins looked like when he had to stand on his own 2 feet. He looked small, he looked broke, and most importantly, He looked like he finally knew that I was the one holding the keys to the kingdom all along. "You think you're so smart," Julian hissed, the words coming out in a spray of pure venom. He had followed me into the library, slamming the heavy oak door with a force that rattled the glass cases of my father's rare book collection. The polished wood and the scent of old leather usually provided a sanctuary of order, but Julian's presence turned the room into a cage. He paced the length of the Persian rug, his breathing ragged and shallow. "You just killed the Jersey deal, Vera. Do you have any idea what you've done? There are contracts in play, there are expectations. You pull the plug now, and you aren't just hurting me, you're destroying the family name." "The family name was destroyed the moment you decided it was a commodity to be traded," I said, standing my ground near the mahogany desk. I felt a strange, cold calm. The shaking in my hands had stopped the moment I walked away from the brunch table. I watched him, really watched him, as he spun around to face me. Julian stopped pacing and leaned in, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "You're going to fix this. You're going to call the bank and tell them it was a clerical error. If you don't, I'm going to tell Mom that you've been borrowing from the family trust to keep your boutique firm afloat. I'll make the numbers work, Vera. She'll believe me. She always believes me." It was the classic Julian gambit, a pivot to a lie so monstrous that it forced the opponent into a defensive retreat. In the past, I would have scrambled to explain, to prove my innocence, and eventually I would have compromised just to stop the noise. But I wasn't the woman I was 48 hours ago. I reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out a single sheet of paper, a high-resolution scan of the Vanguard leasing agreement. I laid it flat on the desk between us. "Do you know what a forensic signature analysis looks like, Julian?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I pointed to the bottom of the page. "Look at the V in Vera. You spent so much time practicing the flourish of the L that you forgot the most basic part of my handwriting. I slant left, you slant right, you always have." Julian looked down at the paper, his jaw tightening so hard I thought his teeth might crack. "This is identity theft," I continued, stepping closer until I was within his personal space. "This is wire fraud. You used my social security number to lease a fleet of luxury vehicles you couldn't afford, and you used the interstate banking system to process the payments. That makes it a federal interest." I watched the realization hit him. It wasn't shame that crossed his face. It was the pure, primal terror of a man who realized his escape routes had all been paved over. "I'm not borrowing anything, Julian. I've been the one subsidizing the trust so Mom and Dad wouldn't notice the dividends you stopped paying them 3 years ago. But this signature, this is a felony. I've already sent a copy of this to the leasing company's fraud department. The Jersey deal didn't die because I stopped paying. It died because you were never the one paying in the first place." He looked at me then, and for the first time in my life, I saw the true Julian. The golden boy mask didn't just crack. It fell away, revealing a hollow, desperate man who had mistaken my kindness for a weakness he could exploit forever. "You wouldn't actually do it," he muttered, his voice losing its edge. "You wouldn't send your own brother to prison." I didn't blink. "I've already done it, Julian. The audit is out of my hands now." I picked up my portfolio and turned toward the door. I could feel his eyes on my back, heavy with a loathing I knew would never fade. But as I turned the handle, I realized that for the first time, I didn't care about his anger. I didn't care about the family name. I had spent my whole life protecting a version of him that didn't exist. Now, all that was left was the math. And in my world, the numbers always tell the truth. I stepped out into the hallway, leaving him alone in the dark of the library, surrounded by the history of a family he had tried to sell for a lease on a lie. The air in the rest of the house felt thinner, sharper. I was finally breathing for myself. By Tuesday morning, the silence was my only weapon. I sat in my office at the firm, the gray Chicago skyline mirrored in the glass of my desk. I had blocked my mother's frantic calls and Julian's erratic messages, which had devolved from tearful apologies to scorched earth threats within the span of an hour. I was an auditor. I knew that the best way to see the truth was to stop the movement. If the water is still, you can finally see what's lurking at the bottom. The fallout was systemic and immediate. Because I had removed my credit card from the primary accounts of Dispatch Pro, the software Julian used to manage his fleet, the system had reached its grace period limit at midnight. I didn't need to be at the warehouse to know exactly what was happening. The trucks would be idling at the depot. The drivers would be unable to access their digital manifests. The GPS tracking would be dark. Every client expecting a shipment would be receiving an automated system error notification. It was a digital heart attack for a company that only lived on borrowed time. I was staring at a spreadsheet of my own recovery plan when my mentor, Marcus Thorne, walked into my office. He didn't knock. He looked older than he had on Friday, his face set in a grim mask of professional concern. "Vera, we have a situation," he said, closing the door and drawing the blinds. He set a printed email on my desk with a heavy hand. "An anonymous whistleblower sent a packet to the ethics committee this morning," Marcus said, his voice low. "The claim is that you've been funneling Summit Logistics revenue through our firm's escrow accounts to hide a personal conflict of interest. They've attached a screenshot of a $5,000 transfer from your personal account to Julian's marked consulting fee, Project X." My stomach turned to ice. Julian hadn't just used my money, he had been tagging the transfers I sent him for emergencies in a way that created a paper trail of professional misconduct. He had anticipated that I might one day turn on him, and he had planted a digital landmine in the middle of my career. "The committee is freezing your pending senior partnership," Marcus continued, his eyes searching mine for a denial I couldn't immediately give. "They're launching a full internal audit of your accounts. Vera, if there is even a grain of truth to this, I can't protect you." I looked at the screenshot. I recognized the date. It was the $5,000 I had sent him last Christmas when he told me the warehouse heater had broken and the pipes were at risk of freezing. I had been so busy with the end-of-year audits that I hadn't even checked the memo line. The twist was a masterpiece of malice. Julian was trying to destroy the only thing I had left, my professional reputation, to force me back into a position where I had to save him to save myself. It was a ransom note written in bank codes. I looked at Marcus and saw the doubt beginning to flicker in his eyes. This was exactly what Julian wanted. He wanted me isolated, he wanted me desperate, but he forgot one thing: I don't just find the fraud, I know how to dismantle it. "I didn't funnel anything, Marcus," I said, my voice cold and hard as the lakefront in January. "I've been being robbed. And if the firm wants an audit, they're going to get the most thorough one in the history of this office, because I've already started one on myself." I realized then that the fight wasn't just about money or family anymore. It was about survival. Julian was willing to burn down my entire world just to keep his own lie warm for one more night. As Marcus left the room, I opened a new file. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I simply began to do what I was born to do. I began to follow the math of the betrayal to its inevitable, devastating conclusion. I started pulling every text message, every emergency call log, and every falsified invoice. If Julian wanted to play in the dirt of a forensic audit, I was going to make sure he drowned in it. The digital blackout I started for his trucks was just the beginning. I was about to turn the lights off on his entire life. I looked back at the skyline, the clouds moving fast over the Willis Tower. The storm was here, but for the first time, I wasn't the one trying to hold back the rain. I was the storm. Julian thought he could hold my career hostage, but he didn't realize that a forensic accountant with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous person in the room. By the time I was done, the only thing left of Summit Logistics would be the red ink of his own making. The rain had turned into a relentless, icy sleet by the time I reached my apartment building. Chicago in the late autumn is a city of shadows, and as I approached the entrance, I saw a figure huddled on the stone steps. It was my mother, Eleanor. She wasn't the polished socialite of the Drake ballroom. She looked small, draped in an old, pilled cardigan that she usually only wore in the privacy of her garden. "Vera, thank God," she sobbed, her voice sounding thin and brittle against the wind. She reached out, her fingers cold and trembling as they latched onto my forearm. "I've been calling and calling. Julian told me everything. He's in a state, Vera. He says there's been a malicious glitch in the system and that you've blocked the override codes." I led her inside, my heart a heavy, leaden weight in my chest. I didn't say a word until we were in my kitchen, a cup of tea steaming between her hands. "It's not a glitch, Mom," I said softly. "It's a boundary." She didn't even hear me. She couldn't. "He says the bank is going to trigger a default," she cried, her eyes red-rimmed and frantic. "He said if you don't sign the emergency software release by morning, the mortgage I took out for him, the one for the family home, will be called in. We'll be on the street, Vera, your father. His heart won't take the stress of an eviction." She fumbled with a crumpled manila folder she had been clutching like a lifeline. "Julian told me to bring you these. He said they're the restructuring documents. He said if you just sign the last page, the bank will stand down. Please, for the sake of your father." I took the folder, my professional instincts screaming at me to look closer. I sat at my kitchen table, the silence of the room punctuated only by my mother's muffled whimpers. I began to flip through the pages. Julian had been clever. The documents were dense with legalese, designed to look like a standard debt consolidation. But as I reached the miscellaneous writers at the back, I stopped. My eyes tracked a specific paragraph tucked between a clause about interest rates and an insurance disclosure. It wasn't a mortgage restructuring, it was a quitclaim deed. The realization was a physical blow, a sudden loss of oxygen. Julian hadn't just asked our mother to borrow money against the house. He had tricked her into signing a document that transferred the entire title of the family estate to a shell company, Summit Holdings LLC, of which he was the sole member. "Mom," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "did you read the papers you signed last month with Julian, the ones at the notary?" "He said they were just standard liability waivers," she said, looking confused and defensive. "He said it was to protect me from the business debts." "He lied," I said, the words feeling like shards of glass in my throat. "You didn't protect the house, Mom. You gave it to him. And according to these new documents, he's already used that equity to secure a predatory private loan to cover his East Coast expansion. He isn't trying to save your home. He's already sold the ground out from under you, and now he wants me to sign off on the liquidation so he can take the cash before the bank catches the fraud." The look of pure, unadulterated shock on her face was more painful than any of Julian's threats. The twist was a masterpiece of cruelty. He wasn't just drowning, he was using our mother as a human shield and then pushing her into the water to stay afloat for one more hour. I looked at the signature line where he wanted me to sign. He was asking me to be the final witness to the theft of our parents' lives. I closed the folder. I realized then that my brother was no longer just a liar or a failed businessman. He was a predator who had run out of strangers to hunt, so he had turned on the people who fed him. I looked at my mother, who was staring at the folder as if it were a bomb. "I'm not signing this, Mom," I said. "And we aren't going to Julian. We're going to the library. We're going to show Dad exactly what his golden boy has been doing in the dark." The sleet continued to hammer against the window. A cold reminder that the storm Julian had started was finally coming for the foundation of everything we knew. I reached for my keys. The time for quiet audits was over. It was time for a reckoning. The atmospheric weight inside the Collins Library was suffocating, a heavy mixture of old paper, mahogany, and a looming storm. Outside, the Chicago sky had turned a bruised, sickly purple, and a sudden flash of lightning illuminated the rows of leather-bound books that represented generations of unasked questions. I walked to the center of the room, my footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug. My father sat in his high-backed recliner, his face ashen in the glow of the green banker's lamp. Eleanor sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands knotting together in her lap as she stared at the floor. Julian stood by the window, his back to all of us, watching the rain lash against the glass. He still had that gold Summit keychain clipped to his belt, a trophy for a victory he'd never actually won. Vera, your mother says you have some imaginative theories about the mortgage, my father said. His voice was strained, a low rasp that betrayed the exhaustion he was trying to hide. I didn't waste time with a preamble. I didn't offer a gentle lead-in. I simply placed 3 identical, heavy manila folders on the desk with a sharp, final thud. One for Dad, one for Mom, one for Julian. I'm not here to offer theories, I said. My voice echoed in the high-ceilinged room, sounding colder and more precise than I'd ever felt. I'm here to conduct a final audit of the self-made man. I walked them through the first folder. I showed my father the receipts for Beatrice's insurance money. I showed him the digital trail where Julian had redirected her husband's death benefit, money meant for a 5-year-old's future, directly into his own personal credit card balances and a high-interest loan for his country club dues. I watched my father's jaw tighten as he saw the dates. Then I turned to the quitclaim deed. Mom didn't sign a mortgage restructuring, Dad. She signed a gift. Julian owns this house through a shell company, and he's already used the equity to secure a predatory private loan that he's currently defaulting on. Julian finally turned around. His face was a mask of cold, concentrated rage, but underneath the anger, I saw the first flickers of a cornered animal's panic. You're out of your depth, Vera, he hissed. You're a mid-level auditor who's jealous of my vision. You're trying to burn the house down because you can't stand that I'm the one who built it. You're pathetic. I didn't flinch. I opened the final folder and pulled out the signature analysis of the Vanguard lease. The golden boy is gone, Julian. All that's left is the math. I've already spoken to the leasing company. I've already sent my firm the proof that you forged the consulting fee memos to frame me. And this quitclaim, it's legally voidable because you obtained it through fraudulent misrepresentation. You didn't build a company, you built a cage. The climax hit with the force of a physical collision. Julian's composure finally shattered into jagged, ugly pieces. He lunged for the folders on the desk, his movements desperate and frantic. Give me those, you don't know what you're talking about, he screamed. But my father, despite his age and the shock that should have paralyzed him, stood up with a sudden, surprising strength. He didn't use force. He didn't have to. He simply placed a heavy, weathered hand on top of the folders, pinning them to the mahogany. He looked at Julian, really looked at him, for the first time in 30 years. The silence was absolute, save for the sudden, violent crash of thunder that rattled the window panes. The math doesn't lie, Julian, my father said. His voice was a low, devastating rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Only you do. In that moment, the myth of the golden boy didn't just crack, it disintegrated. Julian fell back against the window, his chest heaving, the gold keychain glinting one last time before he sank into the shadows of the corner. My mother let out a small, broken sob, a sound of grief for the son she had invented and the daughter she had ignored. I stood at the desk, the auditor who had finally finished the job. The house was still standing, but the foundation of lies had been washed away by the truth. I looked at the folders, then at my brother, and I felt nothing but a vast, quiet space where the guilt used to be. The reckoning was over, the audit was closed. And as the rain hammered against the roof, I realized that the only thing Julian couldn't steal was the one thing he never understood: the power of a name that is actually earned. The collapse of Summit Logistics didn't happen with a cinematic explosion. It happened in a series of quiet, humiliating whimpers that echoed through the cold, cavernous warehouse Julian had called his kingdom. Within 72 hours of the library reckoning, the visionary facade had been stripped away by the clinical hands of banks and lawyers. I stood in the center of the loading dock on Monday morning, the air smelling of stale diesel and damp concrete. The silence was absolute, no roar of engines, no shouting of dispatchers. The fleet sat like a graveyard of white metal in the lot. Because I had presented the forgery evidence and the quitclaim fraud directly to the lender's legal counsel, I had secured a temporary injunction. It was the only thing keeping the locks on the family home from being changed by the end of the week. Julian was there, stripped of his cashmere and his arrogance. He sat on a plastic crate near the shuttered bay doors, his head in his hands. He looked less like a fallen CEO and more like a man who had finally run out of other people's breath to hold. "They're taking the trucks, Vera," he muttered. His voice sounded small against the high corrugated ceilings. "The New Jersey contracts, they're suing for non-performance, it's all gone." I didn't feel the surge of triumph I expected. I just felt a profound sense of relief that the weight of his lies was finally off my shoulders. "It was never there, Julian," I said. My voice echoed, sounding grounded and real in a room full of ghosts. "It was a ghost fleet. You were moving empty boxes and paying for it with stolen credit. You were never building a business. You were just decorating a disaster." The resolution required a surgical precision that only someone with my training could provide. I spent the week liquidating what remained of his hollow empire. The luxury SUV was repossessed from the driveway of the estate, while my mother watched from the window in silence. The gold-plated Summit keychain was tossed into a box of cheap office supplies destined for a thrift store. I negotiated a deal with the district attorney. I told them I would not press charges for the identity theft if Julian signed a full, notarized confession of the debt and agreed to a court-mandated financial oversight program. It wasn't about mercy. It was about ensuring he could never use our name as a weapon again. It was about making sure the audit stayed closed. By Friday, I returned to my firm. The ethics investigation had been formally closed after Marcus presented my self-audit to the board. The metadata from Julian's anonymous tip was the final nail. It proved he had attempted to sabotage a senior partner to cover a felony. The firm didn't just clear me, they apologized. "Senior partner Collins," Marcus said, meeting me in the lobby with a firm handshake. He handed me a folder, not a ledger of debt this time, but a contract of ownership. "Your reputation is the only thing in the city that didn't break this week." I looked at the document and felt the steady beat of my heart. I had earned this. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't a handout. It was the result of 15 years of precision and a week of impossible courage. I went to the dentist that afternoon. I sat in the chair and let the professional care wash over me. As the anesthesia wore off and the new crown was finally fitted, the dull, 18-month ache in my jaw vanished. I ran my tongue over the smooth surface of the tooth and realized the pain hadn't just been in the bone. It had been the physical manifestation of a lie I was no longer required to carry. The liquidation was complete. Julian's ego had been sold off for parts, and for the first time in my adult life, I didn't have to account for anyone but myself. I walked out of the office and into the cool evening air, feeling the space Julian used to occupy in my head finally start to fill with peace. The golden boy was gone, and in his place was a sister who finally knew her own worth. My name is Vera Collins, and my books were finally balanced. 6 months passed. The Chicago winter had finally begun to thaw, leaving the city in a state of dripping, hopeful transition. I sat in my new office in the West Loop, the sun streaming through floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over the river. The water was a murky, moving green, finally free of the ice. My life was finally my own. My credit was healing, my savings were growing, and my apartment was filled with furniture that didn't represent a sacrifice. There were no ghosts in my living room. There were no hidden ledgers in my desk. I had spent so long being the architect of someone else's illusion, terrified that if I stepped away, the world would end. But the world didn't end, it just got quieter, it got clearer. My relationship with my parents existed in a fragile, honest new reality. Elinor no longer talked about self-made visionaries at the country club. She had learned the hard way that a home is held together by truth, not social standing. We spoke once a week now. Short, grounded conversations that didn't involve emergencies or bank wires. They were learning that my value wasn't as a safety net, but as a daughter. It was a slow process, untangling decades of enabling, but for the first time, we were actually speaking the same language. A small, plain manila envelope sat on my desk that Tuesday morning. There was no corporate logo. There was no return address from a high-priced law firm. I opened it to find a money order for exactly $50. Tucked inside was a yellow sticky note in Julian's familiar, right-leaning handwriting. Actual profit from the warehouse night shift, it read. Not a loan, not a bridge, just what I earned, I'm sorry. J. I stared at the slip of paper for a long time. It wasn't the thousands he owed me. It wouldn't even cover the interest on the debt he'd accrued in my name. But as a forensic accountant, I knew the value of a true entry. This was the first honest number Julian had ever produced. By removing my support, I hadn't destroyed him. I had finally given him the ground. He was working in the same warehouse district he once tried to rule, learning the math of a single hour's labor. He was finally learning what it meant to actually be self-made. I looked out at the Chicago skyline, the Sears Tower piercing the clouds. I realized that love is not measured by how much of yourself you allow to be consumed. Real love, real respect, is the courage to let people face the consequences of their own choices. It's the strength to stop saving someone when saving them is destroying you. I picked up a pen and a small card. I didn't write a lecture. I didn't offer a rescue or a bridge loan. I simply wrote 2 words, keep going. I wasn't the fixer anymore. I wasn't the silent partner in a hollow dream. I was Vera Collins, and I had finally learned that the most important signature I would ever write was the one that protected my own peace. I stood up, grabbed my coat, and walked out into the cool Chicago air. The wind off the river was sharp, but it felt good. It felt like a clean slate. I walked toward the train, moving with the crowd, finally, undeniably, self-made. My books were balanced, my debt was paid, and for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I was home. Ultimately, the architecture of a life is not measured by the height of the pedestal one occupies, but by the integrity of the foundation beneath it. We often mistake enabling for empathy, and silence for loyalty, forgetting that true respect for another human being requires us to see them as they are, not as we wish them to be. To respect someone is to honor their capacity for growth, and growth rarely happens in the absence of accountability. When we continually shield those we love from the consequences of their own choices, we do not save them. We merely postpone their meeting with reality, robbing them of the very friction required to sharpen their character. There is a profound, stoic beauty in the realization that our greatest obligation is to our own truth. As the ancient philosophers often mused, we cannot control the storms that others create, but we are the sole masters of the boundaries we set to protect our inner peace. Setting a limit is not an act of cruelty, it is a declaration of value. It is the understanding that our energy, our labor, and our peace are not infinite resources for others to harvest without consent. When the illusions of false success finally fall away, what remains is the simple, honest math of the human spirit. That the only things truly worth owning are the things we have earned with our own hands and the character we have forged in the quiet fire of our own struggles. Thank you for walking through this journey of truth and reclamation with me. If this story resonated with you, or if you've ever had to learn the hard way that no is a complete sentence, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective adds so much value to this community. If you enjoyed this narrative, please consider following and subscribing to the channel to join us for more stories that explore the complexities of the human heart. Your support means everything as we continue to build this space together.